AI came up with a term that might be useful, namely apophenic persuasion. I've been wondering for a while why people find certain arguments to be convincing. What makes them convincing to people? A similar question was once raised by George Lakoff. He was listening to a conservative speaker. I don't know whether it was Bush or somebody else. And while he, as a progressive, could understand every single sentence, he couldn't understand why people were clapping and why people were finding the points he made persuasive, why they thought they were good points. And this is something he couldn't understand. This is something that made no sense to him. How is it possible that you understand every single term, you understand every single sentence, and yet you don't find any of the arguments made to actually be convincing? They don't arouse the same kind of emotional impact on you as they do on another different group of people. And Lakoff started researching this, and one of the ways he began to understand what's going on here is his idea that arguments are not just free floating in empty space, but they always have to connect to some form of narrative and pre existing framing that we already assume. And that kind of makes up our sense of coherence, our sense of having an idea of what is going on in the world. All of that structure, all of that form, all of that order comes in the forms of frames and narratives. And the moment someone can come up with an idea that is compatible with our framing, we experience it as convincing. We experience it as a good point, as somebody making a good point or good observation. And the goodness of the point is not independent of our pre-conscious and unconscious framing that we have to assume. Without the framing itself, these arguments actually become usually meaningless. They lose their um, they lose not only their convincing nature, but they even lose meaning. That's a deeper point. But the phenomenon I've been dealing with is, how is it possible? Take the example, I've recently listened to a debate between Charlie Kirk at Oxford, and the interlocutor was making the point that, hey, to the question of emancipation and how emancipation supposedly caused women to be more unhappy, the interlocutor of Kirk actually made good points and took the whole argument apart and showed actually the linear causality that Kirk is implying here isn't there. You can read the data in far more ways, in more interesting ways, and nuanced ways than the way he presents it. And yet I felt this still wouldn't convince people. People will still get away with the feeling that Charlie Kirk has made a good point. Why? Even though we have pointed out that on a level of analysis, an argument is flawed and there are much better arguments that could be made, people still leave with the feeling, stick with certain explanations which have long been shown, scientifically been shown, to not be the best explanations that we have. And here comes the notion of apophenic persuasion. So apophenia apparently is our tendency to see patterns and to see order in chaos. So whenever we're given a random data set, we try to actually see meaning behind it and see connections. And the same can happen with arguments. So even when an argument seems to be flawed on an analytical level, what we still try to see in arguments is how they possibly relate to some kernel of truth or something that we intuit is right about that. And that relation to a kernel of truth, if you want, is stronger for us than an analytic point of view, which looks at the argument from its, the veracity point of view, like how true is the argument, how valid is the argument. This kernel of truth, felt intuition, I think, overrides objective criteria for whether someone is making a good point or not. And in the case of emancipation, for example, one such kernel of truth that might exist is, for example, that when you treat both genders as equal, many will have the experience that there still are differences in how women and men perceive different professions and different social contexts. For example, I have found myself as a more feminine leaning man, not particularly happy in competitive contexts. Competition is just not something I thrive on. And even as a small kid, I always felt compassion first. Even when we won as a team, I could never really enjoy and be happy about having won against somebody else. I always felt bad for those who lose. And that's not typical for a male. But it's just this is how from within you experience reality. And to claim that females and males were going to experience different social contexts in exactly the same way is just, I think, outright obviously wrong for most people. And I believe many people find themselves in the situation that being forced to, you know, um, being forced on expectations like you should feel equal, like the other sex does in a specific social role. You should feel equally happy, has led many people to actually experience the opposite. They don't feel happy. That doesn't feel right, and the 50-50 rule just doesn't work on them. So in other words, it has to be equally likely for you to be, something that you find rewarding as it is for someone of the opposite sex. Just hasn't worked out for many people. So this is something where people might intuitively be picking up something going on in our culture in general, where this 50-50 rule is like always imposed, and where you feel that something's wrong. And then when someone comes up, like Charlie Kirk, for example, and makes a objectively fallacious argument, which can be shown to be objectively invalid, you still believe it because you connect it to something that seems valid and still it seems like a kernel of truth to you. And it seems more still, this, if you want, invalid argument seems to you to be more capable of picking up something that is a truth for you than the counter position, which basically deconstructs the argument but doesn't come with its own positive, if you want, point or argument or frame that you could then use to simply point to your pain points, which are there. And if there are no pain points, I think arguments just go by usually. They're not even picked up as relevant at all. So this is a way of explaining how it's possible for people to find something to be convincing, even though on the surface it lacks sophistication and differentiation and looks like a bad argument, but at the heart of it is convincing to people for other reasons than the reason the argument itself actually brings to the table. So the argument itself is unconscious of why it's convincing to people. I think this is a massively widespread phenomenon, and also, of course, something that is true of religion. So even if you are an atheist like me, you still have to understand why certain ideas are convincing to people and why so many people in the past have clung to them and have found them to have some kind of depth to them. You still have that job. You still have to figure out like what is the proximate issue that these ideas that formally you don't agree with still pick up that you might not be seeing, so that other people find the overall framework convincing in the first place.